Welcome to the Quest Forums channel, and in today's video we're looking at a question I recently received from a friend. He's wondering about when people have to work on Sundays, because there's a lot of people who of course must. And he's specifically thinking about emergency services and necessary services like power plants and water plants, road crews sometimes, police, of course, and hospital workers. And if those people are Christians and that's our day of worship, then what does that mean for them? Now, to begin with, this dovetails nicely with another question that I was asked just a few days afterward, where someone was wondering, why do we worship on Sundays at all? Why is that the day of Christian worship? And that is a good place to start. And the reason, very simply, is because that's the day of the week that Jesus came back to life. And with his resurrection, which we've just celebrated this past Sunday with Easter, when that happened on that day of the week, it was sort of like it paralleled the creation account in Genesis 1. And so when in the very first day God said, "Let there be light," and now with Jesus' resurrection, it's a new creation. He's bringing a new light and a new life to the world. And so we've just made that the day that we gather to praise him. This is a very old, ancient, in fact, it's an original tradition of the church because we have it talked about in the Bible. There's a few places. Acts, where does it say? Chapter 20, verse 7, where they met on Sunday, on the first day of the week. And then Paul directs the Corinthians believers in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 2, to do their offering on the first day of the week, because he's just assuming that's when they're going to gather. And then by the time Revelation was written by the Apostle John, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, he calls Sunday the Lord's Day. And so it's already known by that in the very first couple decades of the church. From the very beginning, they gathered together to worship on Sundays, and Christians have been doing that ever since. Now, it is important to note that it is not a commandment. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that we must gather on Sundays, and the Bible does talk about other days of the week when Christians did gather. And so it's not that there's a role to follow here. Again, it's just been a very useful tradition, and it's something that's been the pattern for Christians for all this time. That doesn't mean that you are necessarily sinning by not gathering on a Sunday. And that's kind of where I want to move from this point, is sort of applying the thinking and the necessity of worship. And we can do that by kind of moving from the greater to the lesser. You have a lot of talk in the New Testament where Jesus points to things about Sabbath regulations. And the Sabbath, of course, was the last day of the week. It's Saturday. And the ancient Israelites were required to stop from their labors. They were required to rest on that day. And Jesus says in a number of places that there are exceptions from that requirement for rest, because there are things that are necessary to be done. And he talks about regulations for eating and for healing people and for rescuing animals. There's a number of things that he brings up. I mentioned some of them in the article, and just as a way to say that this is not a hard and fast rule. It's just the idea of what you're supposed to do is rest. And so if that is the Old Testament law, and Christians, meanwhile, are looking towards just the practice of worshiping on Sundays, then definitely there can be exceptions to having to meet to worship and to rest on Sunday, on the first day of the week. That's not a sin to do that. It's not needed to be a source of guilt, especially when you have to work. These are things that must be done. And so there's an exception for you. You shouldn't have to feel burdened if there are Sundays when you can't make it to church. Now, what should you do with that? Because there's obviously a lot of things that church provides that are important to have for a Christian. And so if you're in that situation where there are Sundays where you have to miss, I would just recommend taking some stopgap measures, just some things that you can do to sort of maintain that connection. And so there are many different gatherings midweek when Christians get together. It's a good idea to do those, whether your church has small groups or maybe a Wednesday night fellowship, something along that line is good to take part in. Checking out people who provide teaching during the week. So what I do, I think, is an example, something that you could be involved in, and then maybe your church records the service from Sunday, and maybe you have a chance during the week to watch that or listen to the sermon, something along that line. Christian music goes well here. If you have a radio or a streaming service, then hopefully have the opportunity to maybe listen some of that and to engage in praise that way. And another thing I think is important to mention is that churches do rely on our offerings and the way that we support them, and that's not really an admission ticket. It's not that you pay that money just when you're there and it doesn't matter when you're not. It's really more, and again, I don't want to make it like it's an obligation, because the Apostle Paul is pretty clear about that. In 2 Corinthians, it's supposed to be cheerful giving, it's an offering. But even so, if that's a commitment that you're making, then it's good to make on a regular basis. And so you might want to think about making it up to the church the next time you get back there, or maybe sending your offering in with somebody else who's going when you can't go, that sort of thing. And these are just some things to bear in mind that can maybe be useful. Again, they're not going to replace the Sunday service, but they're just a way to kind of get you through each week until you can get back on Sundays, because I still think that's the most important thing to do, is to gather when the whole church is gathering, and that's a very valuable thing to do. But these are just ways that you can stay connected with God and with your fellow Christians during the course of the week on those times when you can't get there on the first day of the week. And so one last thing I did want to mention, this is not about Sunday in particular. It's more kind of going back to that idea of the Sabbath that I was talking about. And again, that's an Old Testament law, it's an ancient Israelite law, and so it's not something that applies to, especially to Gentile Christians today. But there's still a principle there that's an important one. It's the principle of rest. And Sunday's a natural day for us to do that. Because it goes from, we start with worship in the morning, and then we can hopefully spend the rest of the day relaxing and contemplating our relationship with God and with our families and maybe with our church friends and whatever the case may be. And so that's a valuable thing. Now again, what we're talking about here is not everyone's going to be able to do that on a Sunday. But sometimes the reason why you can't do it on a Sunday is because you're working so much that you can't do it at any time. And that is a really unhealthy thing. It is possible to work too much. Our culture doesn't say so, and I've written and talked about this before, that being constantly busy is seen as a virtue in our culture, but it's not a biblical virtue, and it is very important to be able to take some time to stop. And again, if you're in some type of necessary service, you might not be able to do that, and I understand that, and God understands that too. And we are, at least I am, grateful for the services that you're providing. And so I don't want to call that into question, but I'm just saying, as you have opportunity to rest, you should take it. That's a good thing, and it's something that the Lord does want to provide for you. And so hopefully this does kind of all answer the question. And to boil it down, I do want to say, if you have to work on Sunday, you don't need to feel guilty about the things that you're required to do. And for those things that you're not required to do, look for ways to be pragmatic about them. Look for ways to maybe set aside time for rest or for being able to go to church on Sunday. That's a good thing to do. And if you're in a situation where you can't do those things, look for those other ways to be engaged. And just remember that work is a good thing, but so is rest, and so especially is maintaining your relationship with God and with your brothers and sisters. And so just make that a priority, because it should be among them. Now, thanks very much for the question, and for the rest of you turning in to watch this video. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions about the Bible or your relationship with God, I'd love to hear them. You can leave a comment here, or get in touch with me on the social media, send an email, whatever works best for you. If you would, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And also, for anyone who maybe hasn't done so yet, I'd appreciate you considering a donation to the Quest Forums ministry. There's a link to my Patreon below. You can check that out. Your monthly support would be greatly appreciated as I continue to pursue the growth of this ministry. And again, that is the end. I appreciate you checking it out. And until next time, keep looking up.